King Orion stood at the edge of his high balcony. Below him, the two great fleets of Velari warships gleamed under the pale sun. He spoke in a low voice to his council. They all knew what he would say next. After years of quiet conflict, he would offer his daughter to the humans. This act would bind their peoples together. None could deny its weight. Yet Orion believed in peace more than war. Princess Sarah listened in her chamber. She had spent her life learning court manners and diplomatic speech. Her body was weak. A rare illness had made her fragile. She could barely lift a goblet of water without trembling. She wore fine robes of soft fabric that floated around her like mist. Her golden hair lay in a single braid down her back. She had never known weapons or battle. In her heart, she felt fear at her father's plan. On Earth, John Hunter moved through a busy hall of human ambassadors. He had once served as a Marine. Now he worked as a diplomat. He had seen the edge of war and the toll it could take on a person. He understood loyalty and duty. When he heard his next assignment, he felt pride and worry at the same time. He would meet the Velari princess. He would care for her on the long journey home. He did not know how fragile she was, but he would learn soon enough. The morning came for Sarah's departure. Her chamber doors opened, and she stepped into the hallway. Her steps were slow but sure. Orion watched her from the balcony, his face stern and calm. He bowed his head once, then spoke to the human envoy by Comlink. "She is yours now," he said. Sarah felt the weight of her father's words. She closed her eyes and drew a shaky breath. John stood on the landing pad of the starship Dawnlight. The ship's white hull towered above him. He wore a simple uniform and held a tablet with Sarah's travel plan. He saw her float down the ramp, supported by two Velari guards. Her skin was pale under the sun. Her hands looked thin and fragile. He felt a sudden need to help her. "Princess Sarah," he said softly. She nodded and offered him a small, polite smile. Inside the ship, gravity systems adjusted around Sarah. She wobbled as her boots met the deck. John reached out. "Let me help," he said. Sarah's eyes widened, but she took his hand. The touch felt warm and real. Sarah walked to her cabin with John guiding her. She stared at the long corridor lit by soft lights. Every step made her heart pound, but she did not stop. For days, they traveled through star lanes. Sarah learned the patterns of human space. She grew used to the gentle hum of the engines. John shared simple stories of Earth. He spoke of green forests, blue oceans, and children playing in wide fields. Sarah listened, her eyes shining with wonder. She told him about Velari crystal gardens and cities carved from living rock. John smiled at her soft voice and kind heart. One morning, alarms rang through the ship. Space pirates attacked. The deck thrummed with shouts and blaster fire. John grabbed a sidearm and moved to defend the bridge. Sarah watched from the corridor, her heart racing. She saw sparks flicker on the walls. John's voice came in her comlink. "Stay back, princess." Sarah gripped the railing but did not run. She felt something stir inside her. After the attack, the pirates fled. Damage teams repaired the hull. Sarah's cabin door opened and John stepped in. His uniform was smudged with dust. He held out a small med kit. "You did well," he said. Sarah blinked. She had only watched, but she felt a sense of pride. Her hand shook as she fixed a bandage on her wrist. John's calm presence made her feel safe. Over the next week, John taught Sarah simple moves to protect herself. He showed her how to steady her breathing. He guided her arm to hold the training blade. Sarah's first strikes were awkward. The blade felt heavy. She hit the mat instead of the target. Each time, John encouraged her. His voice was gentle, never harsh. Sarah practiced until the hum of the engines felt like a drum guiding her rhythm. They spent evenings in the ship's small garden chamber. Soft lights hung above alien plants. Sarah touched a green leaf. She had never seen life so bright. John sat beside her and shared stories of human music and art. Sarah closed her eyes and imagined dancing in a Velari hall. She felt a new strength growing inside her bones. On the day before they reached human space, Sarah stood on the deck again. She breathed in the artificial air. Below her, the ship moved past distant stars. John stood quietly by her side. She turned and met his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. John nodded. He had seen her fragile body grow stronger. He believed in her in a way he could not explain. Far ahead, the frontier station came into view. Lights glowed around its rings. Sarah's heart pounded with hope and fear. She would meet human leaders soon. King Arian's promise would bring peace or shatter all they hoped for. Sarah let go of John's hand and walked forward on her own too. Feet. Each step was firmer than the last. She was fragile no longer. Sarah stepped from the Dawnlight's airlock and felt the cool breeze of the frontier station. She paused for a moment, letting her lungs fill with new air. John stood beside her, his hand lightly on her elbow in case she wobbled. The station's platform stretched out before them like a woven net. Lights blinked along rails. Distant ships glided in slow arcs. Sarah's heart raced with excitement and fear. She had left Valari home just days before, and now she stood on human soil. The station's commander, Captain Alicia Tran, greeted them at the base of the ramp. Tran was a tall woman with calm eyes and a firm voice. She wore a simple uniform and carried no visible weapon, but her posture spoke of quiet strength. She bowed to Sarah with respect and to John with a nod. "Welcome to Gamma Outpost," she said. "We will host you until you are ready for the treaty talks." Sarah offered a gentle smile and inclined her head. She tried to match Tran's calm, but her hands trembled slightly. They walked through the station halls. Smooth walls curved overhead. Soft lights glowed in panels. Sarah balanced on every step. She felt both curious and nervous. John explained that the station served as a training site and meeting place for diplomats. Sarah glanced at signs in human languages she could barely read. She heard voices in many accents. Children laughed in a distant play area. For a moment, she forgot her role as a princess and simply felt like a girl far from home. In the training wing, Tran introduced Sarah to Sergeant Maria Bell. Bell was a human soldier known for her gentle teaching style. She wore a standard uniform and a friendly smile. Sarah bowed again. Bell extended her hand. Sarah took it, feeling the warmth of human skin. Maria guided Sarah to a practice area. Soft mats covered the floor. Wooden swords and light armor hung on racks. Sarah's eyes widened at the tools of war she had never seen before. Maria spoke in clear, simple words. She showed Sarah how to strap on a practice vest. The vest felt heavy on Sarah's small frame, but she bore the weight without complaint. Maria handed her a wooden blade, smooth and balanced. "Hold it here," she said, placing Sarah's hands on the grip. Sarah wrapped her fingers around the wood. Her knuckles turned white. She looked at John, who gave her an encouraging smile. Sarah raised the blade and tapped it against the mat. The sound echoed in the hall. Maria taught Sarah a basic stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees bent, blade held at the center. Sarah did her best to copy the pose. She swayed and lost balance once, but she corrected herself. Maria spoke calmly and softly. Each word helped Sarah focus. After a few attempts, Sarah stood steadier. She felt a small spark of pride. She was fragile no more. She was learning to stand and fight. John watched from the sidelines. He had joined Maria and Sarah for training on his own time. He wore old marine fatigues that fit more loosely now. He stepped forward to demonstrate a guard position. Sarah studied his posture. His feet were firm, his shoulders relaxed. He held his blade ready. Sarah mimicked his movements. She felt the wooden sword respond to her touch. It trembled less with each breath. The next day, Maria increased the challenge. She paired Sarah with a young recruit named Alex. Alex was thin and quick. He moved with practiced ease and swung gently to test Sarah's blocks. Sarah defended herself awkwardly at first. Alex's wooden blade tapped against her vest with a dull thud. Each tap made her wince. Maria urged Sarah to breathe and keep her eyes on Alex's chest. Sarah took a deep breath and raised her guard. When Alex struck again, Sarah met his blade squarely. The mat shook under their feet. Sarah held the block for a heartbeat longer before she withdrew. Surprise crossed Alex's face. Sarah blinked, then lowered her sword. She felt a rush of triumph. After the drill, Sarah sat on a bench to rest. Her legs ached and her arms felt heavy. John brought her a water flask and sat beside her. He handed the flask with a gentle nod. Sarah drank gratefully and set the flask down. Her hair clung to her neck with sweat. She smiled at John. "This is harder than I thought," she said. John shrugged. "Any new task feels hard at first," he said. "You did well against Alex." Sarah's chest rose with a deep breath. She believed him. Over the next week, Sarah trained every morning and evening. Maria taught her footwork, ways to dodge blades, and how to hold a shield. John guided her breathing and reminded her to rest between drills. Sarah's body grew stronger, her breathing steadied. She learned to trust her muscles and mind. Each night she returned to her cabin feeling proud and exhausted. She dreamed of moving through battles with grace. Her illness felt farther away. With every session, during a midday break, Sarah explored the station's small garden with John. Synthetic plants grew in colorful arrangements. A fountain bubbled in the center. Bench seats invited visitors to pause. Sarah knelt beside a patch of blue flowers. She touched the petals lightly. John sat next to her, watching the water dance. In the fountain, Sarah spoke of Valari crystal gardens, of light trapped in stone. John listened with wide eyes. He had never heard of gardens like that. They sat in silence for a while, sharing a calm moment. One afternoon, political envoys arrived. They stepped off a transport shuttle in formal attire. Their faces were serious. Whispers followed them through the hallways. Sarah watched from a balcony as agents from Valari demanded to see her at once. They spoke angrily with Captain Tran. Sarah's heart pounded. John saw her pale face and took her hand. He guided her away from the balcony. Sarah leaned on him as they walked to a secluded corridor. In the corridor, Sarah turned to John. "They want me to return," she said, voice shaking. John placed a hand on her shoulder. "They fear you will change," he said. "They see your strength here." Sarah felt tears burn behind her eyes. She looked at John's steady gaze. She felt safe. She wiped her cheeks. "I cannot go back empty-handed," she said softly. "I need to finish my promise." John nodded. "We will speak with retrievers when the time is right." Sarah took a deep breath. The next dawn, Sarah faced the envoys and Captain Tran in the council chamber. A curved table sat in the center of the room. Transparent walls looked out at distant stars. Sarah stood beside John at the head of the table. The envoys wore crystalline robes that glowed softly. They spoke in their native tongue, but Tran and John translated. They said Sarah had no right to train with humans. She belonged to Valari rule and ritual. Sarah lifted her chin and spoke in clear, measured words. She told them of her progress, of the strength she had found, and of her duty to both peoples. Her voice was soft but firm. The envoys exchanged nervous glances. They fell silent. After Sarah spoke, Captain Tran addressed the envoys. She praised Sarah's courage and potential as a leader and a warrior. She argued that Sarah's presence on Earth would strengthen the treaty. The envoys looked between Tran and John. Finally, they bowed low and accepted Sarah's choice to stay until the talks. Sarah felt a surge of relief. She glanced at John and saw pride in his eyes. She had grown beyond fear. She had claimed her role. That evening, Sarah returned to the training wing for one last session before the treaty talks. Maria smiled and handed her the wooden blade. Sarah gripped it with steady hands. She faced Alex again. This time, their match lasted longer. Sarah blocked and parried with confidence. Alex pressed forward and struck near her shoulder. Sarah spun and countered, her blade meeting his with firm contact. Both blades rang out. Sarah found a rhythm. Her steps were precise. Her arms moved with strength. She felt the pulse of the mat beneath her boots. At the end of the drill, she stood breathless but triumphant. John entered the wing and applauded. Maria joined in. Sarah lowered her blade and bowed to them both. She felt the warm glow of achievement. Her body still ached, but her heart was light. She had faced doubt and conquered it. She was no longer a fragile princess. She was a warrior in the making. Later, as Sarah prepared for bed, she looked out the window at the turning station. Stars drifted by like silent witnesses. She lay down and closed her eyes. Her first full day of trial and victory replayed in her mind. She felt gratitude for John, for Maria, and for this chance. She whispered a vow in Valari language to protect both worlds. Then she drifted into sleep, ready for what the next day would bring. The morning light filtered through the council chamber's windows as Sarah returned to face the envoys. She stood beside John near the long table, her armor polished and her posture steady. Captain Tran and Sergeant Bell flanked them. The Valari envoys took their seats across the table, their crystal robes glowing faintly. Silence filled the room as the translator began. One envoy spoke first, his voice cool. "Princess, we accept your progress. Yet the treaty terms remain uncertain. Human leaders demand proof of your people's word." He paused, eyes on Sarah. Sarah met his gaze without fear. She recalled her training, the lessons from Maria, and the trust John had placed in her. When the translator finished, Sarah spoke. "I will stand with you at the treaty talks. I will show our peoples that peace can last." Her voice was calm and soft, yet firm enough that the envoys listened. John nodded in support. Captain Tran gave Sarah a slight bow. The envoys whispered among themselves, then agreed. Soon Sarah and John prepared to travel to Earth for the signing ceremony. They boarded a diplomatic cruiser escorted by Valari ships. Sarah felt the hum of the vessel beneath her feet. She held a satchel with her formal attire, a simple dress woven from Valari silk. Maria had gifted it to her with a note of encouragement. Sarah placed her hand on the satchel and drew strength from it. As the cruiser slipped into human space, alarms blared. The ship rocked from an unexpected blast. Sarah steadied herself against the wall. John rushed to her side, his face tense. "Pirates again," he said. "They follow us from the frontier." The cruiser's crew activated defensive shields. Sarah watched the view screen as small raiders darted around the larger escort ships. Without waiting, Sarah moved toward the weapons console. She recalled her lessons with Maria. She had learned basic controls on the Dawnlight. Here, the system was more advanced, but the principles were the same. John saw her approach and stepped back, giving her room. Sarah tapped commands with careful fingers. Her heart pounded, but she stayed focused. A raider vessel broke through the shields and fired on the cruiser's rear. Sarah adjusted the targeting reticle and launched a defensive drone. It streaked into space and intercepted the attacker. The torpedo hit the raider's hull with a bright flash. The raider spun out of control and drifted away. The crew cheered. John placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder and smiled. "You did well," he said. Sarah nodded, feeling pride. The raiders continued their assault. Sarah and John moved to the command deck to help Captain Tran. Tran directed the crew with calm authority. Sarah relayed tactical data to the pilots while John secured injured crew members. They worked side by side, human and Valari, united by purpose. After a tense hour, the raiders retreated. The cruiser sustained minor damage, but no lives were lost. Sarah studied the view screen, watching the stars drift by. She felt a deep connection to the humans who had defended her. She thought of Valari gardens where light danced in crystal leaves. Here, in battle, light danced in explosions that shattered ships. She wondered how two worlds so different could share hope. When the cruiser docked at the Earth Embassy station, the human diplomats greeted Sarah with cautious respect. Their leader, Ambassador Young, welcomed her in a grand hall filled with flags of Earth's nations. Sarah's silver dress shimmered in the light. She held John's arm as they walked the red carpet. Cameras flashed. Whispers followed them. Sarah felt both nervous and proud. Inside the hall, human leaders from every continent gathered. The treaty table stretched wide, flanked by Valari chambers on the opposite side. The air buzzed with anticipation. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. John gave her a reassuring nod. She addressed the assembly in clear, simple words. I come from a world far from yours. My people and yours have known conflict. Today I stand here to end it. I ask you to trust me, as my father, King Orion, trusts you now. Her words echoed in the hall. Some faces showed hope, others doubt. Then she unrolled a vellum scroll, sealed with Valari crystal wax. The terms of peace and cooperation gleamed in gold and blue ink. One human leader rose. She spoke of Earth's fear of betrayal. Sarah listened. When the translator finished, she replied gently, Trust must grow like a seed. Let our actions water it. She smiled at John, who held her hand. The crowd murmured in approval. The human leader bowed and signed the treaty. With that, the room erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears in her eyes. She had fulfilled her promise. She had given her people peace. Across the table, the Valari envoy signed the treaty as well. The crystal wax seals snapped shut. A new era began. After the ceremony, Sarah stepped into a quiet garden attached to the embassy. Fountains bubbled and soft lights shone on pale flowers. John joined her, carrying 2 cups of warm tea. He handed one to Sarah. She sipped and savored the heat. They sat on a stone bench beneath an arch of vines. You were brave today, John said. You showed both worlds what can be. Sarah smiled. I learned from you, from Maria, and from Captain Tran. She paused. I want to visit Valari Gardens with you someday. John returned her smile. I would like that. They sat in silence, sharing the moment. Later, Sarah prepared for her next task, teaching human soldiers Valari techniques to strengthen the alliance. She met with Sergeant Bell in a training hall. Bell guided a group of recruits through Valari footwork and discipline drills. Sarah demonstrated each move with grace. The soldiers watched in awe as she coordinated sword swings and defensive stances. Sarah's illness felt like a distant memory. One recruit, Ben, stumbled during the drill. Sarah approached him and offered gentle guidance. She placed her hand on his shoulder and adjusted his stance. Ben's eyes lit with respect. He bowed to Sarah before resuming. Sarah felt joy in helping others grow. That evening, Sarah and John shared a simple meal in the embassy cafeteria. She ate vegetable stew and bread. Her appetite had returned after weeks of training. John talked about his family back on Earth. Sarah listened, picturing his childhood home with wide fields and tall trees. She missed Valari night skies, where stars danced like fireflies. After dinner, Sarah returned to her quarters. She opened a small box that Maria had given her. Inside lay a wooden training blade engraved with Valari symbols. Sarah held it close and closed her eyes. She thought of the lessons she had learned, to trust herself, to stand with others, and to lead with compassion. The next morning, Sarah rose before dawn to train alone. She slipped into the garden and practiced her moves under pale light. The air smelled of dew and fresh growth. Sarah focused on each step, her feet, her grip, her breath. She moved like water flowing around rocks. With each revolution she felt stronger. When John found her, she bowed and offered a warm smile. He held 2 cups of tea again. Sarah accepted the cup and said, I want to keep learning, even after the alliance is signed. John's eyes brightened. Then we will train together as friends. Sarah nodded, her heart full of hope. The day of departure came. Sarah and John prepared to leave Earth Embassy. They boarded the cruiser that would take them back to Valari. Space. As the ship lifted, Sarah looked at the planet below. She saw cities of light, rivers, and forests. She felt that Earth had become part of her. In the cruiser's cabin, Sarah wrote a letter to King Orion. She described the treaty, the promise kept, and the bond she shared with John. She sealed it with crystal wax and placed it in her satchel. Then she lay down and closed her eyes. Dreams of 2 worlds dancing together filled her sleep. When the cruiser reached Valari space, Sarah would return not as a fragile princess, but as a warrior and ambassador. She had faced doubts, battled pirates, and united 2 peoples. Ahead lay new challenges, but Sarah knew she was ready. With John by her side and the strength she had forged, she would protect the fragile peace and help it grow strong. Sarah stepped from the cruiser onto the polished stone of Valari soil. The air felt warmer here. She felt the wind on her face. John stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. Sarah looked around at the grand spires of her home city. She saw tall towers carved from glowing rock. She heard voices calling greetings. Soldiers in gleaming armor lined the path. They raised their blades in salute. Sarah bowed her head in return. Her heart swelled with pride and a bit of nervousness. She had come far since the day she first left Valari. King Orion stood on a dais at the palace entrance. His crystal robe caught the light. He smiled as Sarah approached. His eyes shone with fatherly warmth. He stepped down and embraced her. Sarah felt his strong arms around her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment. She told him of the treaty's success. She spoke of human trust and shared victory. Orion listened, his chest rising and falling. When she finished, he said in a quiet voice, "You have made us proud." Sarah looked up and saw joy in his eyes. The crowd cheered as Orion led Sarah and John into the throne hall. Banners of velvet blue hung from the ceiling. Crystal chandeliers lit the room in soft light. Nobles in fine garments filled the halls. Benches, some whispered among themselves. Others watched Sarah with wonder. Sarah felt both strength and dread. She wondered if all Valari would accept her new role. She stood beside Orion, her silver armor gleaming. John stood just behind her, silent and steady. Once seated, Orion addressed the assembly. He praised the treaty and the bond between Valari and humans. He spoke of Sarah's courage on human worlds. He spoke of John's loyalty. The nobles listened, some nodding and some frowning. One noble rose, his voice cool. He questioned the wisdom of trusting humans. He warned of betrayal and weakness. Whispers spread like wind through the hall. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew the words she must speak. When the noble finished, Sarah rose. She stood, tall in her armor. She spoke in a clear voice. She told of the human shields she had seen. She told of the battle where she had launched the drone. She spoke of John's care when she fell in training. She told of soldiers on both sides who had risked their lives for her. Her words fell softly but firmly. She said, "Strength comes from trust." She paused. She looked at each noble in turn. "I ask you to stand with me, not as judge but as ally." Silence filled the hall. Arion stood and clapped once. Others joined him. Some nobles rose with reluctant respect. The room brightened with applause. Sarah exhaled, relief washing over her. She returned to her seat beside Orion. John bowed to the assembly. Nobles inclined their heads to both of them. Sarah felt a new bond forming in stone halls and guarded hearts. In the days that followed, Sarah met with military leaders. She joined Captain Tran and Sergeant Bell in planning a joint training exercise. Human and Valari soldiers would learn each other's tactics. Sarah watched as Valari guards practiced gravity leaps and crystal blade strikes. She saw humans move with swift strikes and tight formations. She moved among them, offering guidance and encouragement. She tried each technique herself, her armor, moving with her like a second skin. Each step felt natural now. Each blade stroke felt controlled and strong. One morning, Sarah led a mixed troop into the training grounds outside the palace. Humans in blue uniforms marched beside Valari warriors in white. Flags of both worlds fluttered on poles. Sarah stood before them on a low rise. She held her sword in both hands, the tip resting on the ground. She spoke briefly of unity and strength. Then she raised the sword and shouted, "Advance!" The troops moved as one. The ground shook under their steps. Targets made of wood and stone lined the field. Sarah signaled with her sword. Valari soldiers dashed forward and struck their targets with crystal blades. Human soldiers moved in tight lines, using shields to protect their flank. Sarah ran along the edge of the formation, calling out tips and encouragement. She saw Sergeant Bell adjusting a recruit's grip. She saw Captain Tran urging a Valari guard to keep pace. She saw John moving among the humans, his calm presence steadying them after the drill. Sarah joined Tran and Belle at a low table. They reviewed the performance. Both sides had shown skill and eagerness. Sarah noted where they could improve. She said, "We learn from each other." She sketched a map of the field with simple lines. She marked where humans could guard Valari advance and where Valari could break enemy lines. John watched her, pride in his eyes. Sarah felt new confidence in her role as bridge between worlds. That afternoon, Sarah walked to the palace gardens. With John, she wore light robes instead of armor. The gardens bloomed with alien flowers whose petals glowed and whispered when the wind blew. Sarah knelt by a fountain of crystal water. She dipped her fingers in the clear flow. She thought of the battles she had faced and the lessons she had learned. John sat beside her on a carved bench. He offered her tea in a porcelain cup. She thanked him and took a sip. The warmth spread through her chest. John spoke of home, of fields of grass and forests of oak. Sarah nodded as she listened. She spoke of Valari moons that shone in 6 colors. She told him how she had first learned to walk in human gravity with his help. They sat in comfortable silence until the sun dipped below the horizon. Sarah watched the lights come on in the palace towers. She felt that 2 worlds glowed in harmony now. That night, Sarah returned to her quarters to find a message from Maria Bell. The message invited her to join a special council of trainers the next day. Sarah read the note and smiled. She placed it on her desk next to a photo of her and John on the cruiser. She lay down and fell asleep quickly, her dreams full of blended armies and dancing lights. The next morning, Sarah entered the training hall where Maria, Tran, and other instructors had gathered. A holographic display glowed in the center of the room. It showed a map of border worlds. Sarah studied it with the trainers. Each saw threats from rogue pirate groups and lingering tensions. They planned patrol routes and joint exercises. Sarah suggested a rotation of mixed patrols led by both Valari and human officers. She explained how balance and shared command would build trust. The trainers nodded in approval. They saw the value in her plan. At midday, a messenger arrived with urgent news. A pirate fleet had attacked a small colony of human settlers near the Border World series. Settlers were trapped and outgunned. John and Sarah read the report together. Sarah felt a quick rush of worry. She said, "We must help them." Tran and Belle agreed. Sarah organized a rescue team of ships and troops. She divided human and Valari forces into strike teams and support wings. She gave orders with clear, simple words. She spoke of speed and safety. Within hours, Sarah and John boarded a frigate bound for Ceres. The ship jumped through space lanes in a blur of light. Sarah paced the deck, her armor strapped on. John prepared medical supplies and boarding gear. Sarah checked her blade and sidearm. She looked at John. He gave her a nod and a small smile. Sarah felt calm in his steady gaze. As the frigate dropped out of hyperspace, Ceres came into view. Smoke rose from settlements. Bright flashes marked pirate guns. Sarah felt anger at the attackers and fear for the settlers. She turned to the crew and said, "We will save them." She led the charge into the hangar bay. Troops poured out in unified rows. Human and Valari soldiers linked arms. They ran toward shuttles that would land on Ceres. The landing was rough. Laser fire hit the shuttle's hull. Sarah and John stumbled out onto rocky ground. They saw settlers huddled behind rocks. Pirates fired from makeshift bunkers. Sarah raised her blade and called out, "Forward!" Human and Valari troops advanced in lockstep. Saber and blaster light cut through the gray afternoon. Sarah moved among them, striking where she was needed. She pulled a child to safety and guided settlers to a hidden canyon. John worked beside a medic, treating wounds. Sarah fought off pirates who tried to trap a group of settlers. She held her ground, blade flashing. Then Valari archers and human sharpshooters appeared on a hill. They unleashed a precise volley that scattered the pirates. The tide turned. Sarah rallied the troops and led a final push. The pirates fled, leaving behind captured settlers and a few wounded enemies. After the fight, Sarah and John helped the settlers into transports. Faces shone with relief and gratitude. Sarah knelt beside an elderly man. He held her hand and thanked her in simple words. Sarah smiled and said, "We protect each other." She rose and saw John helping a young woman with a broken arm. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. She had faced battle and won. She had united two peoples in a moment of crisis. On the way back to Valari space, Sarah stood on the bridge of the frigate. She watched the stars slide by. John joined her at the rail. They stood in silence, sharing the quiet after battle. Sarah placed a hand on John's arm. She said, "I know who I am now." John looked at her and said, "You are a warrior and a leader." Sarah looked out at the stars and felt hope bloom. She knew the final trials awaited, but she also knew she would meet them with courage and trust. She had become the bridge between worlds, and her journey was just beginning. Sarah woke before dawn, the soft glow of Valari moons bright through her window. She rose and dressed in simple robes, then stepped onto her balcony. Below, the city lay quiet under a pale sky. She thought of the journey she had made, from fragile princess to warrior and peacemaker. She wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and walked to the training grounds. There, human and Valari soldiers practiced in the cool morning air. Sarah paused and watched them work together. She felt a deep pride. This place, once full of doubt, now rang with laughter and shared purpose. She knew her final challenge lay ahead, but she felt ready. The Great Council had convened in the Central Hall to ratify the permanent alliance. Banners of Earth and Valari hung side by side. Sarah stood before the council, her polished armor catching the light. Elders and diplomats filled the stone benches, their expressions mixed. Some looked hopeful, others skeptical. Sarah felt her heart beat steadily. She stepped forward and spoke in a clear voice. "Today we seal a promise between two worlds. This bond can bring peace for generations." She paused and let her words sink in. Then she placed her signed treaty scroll on the marble table. A hush fell, and then applause rose like a tide. Sarah bowed her head and returned to her seat beside King Orion. After the ceremony, the palace courtyard filled with music and color. Valari musicians played soft melodies on crystal flutes, while human performers danced with ribbons of bright cloth. Sarah moved through the crowd, greeting both human envoys and Valari nobles. Children ran about, their laughter lighting the air. Stalls offered foods from both worlds, Valari fruit pastries and human spice stew. Sarah tasted each dish and smiled at the mingling flavors. She saw John laughing with a human diplomat over a shared joke. The moment felt like a dream made real. In this simple joy, Sarah saw the true power of unity. Later, Sarah found John by a fountain that mirrored the sky. He held 2 cups of warm tea. Sarah accepted one and took a sip. The flavor was familiar and comforting. They sat in silence until Sarah spoke. "I remember our first day on the Dawnlight when I could barely stand." John smiled gently and said, "You have come far since then." Sarah looked at him and felt gratitude. She said, "I could not have done this without you." John placed his hand over hers. "You found your own strength," he replied. Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. They shared a quiet moment before the next event began. That afternoon, Sarah led a demonstration of joint tactics in the palace field. Valari guards in white armor formed a circle around human soldiers in blue. Sarah stood at the center, sword in hand. She called out commands, and the troops moved as one. Valari guards leapt through low-gravity jumps while humans held shield walls. Sarah ran among them, offering guidance and encouragement. She joined a human squad to show how to adapt Valari stance for Earth gravity. The soldiers followed her lead, their movements growing confident. At the end, both sides cheered. Sarah raised her sword overhead. In that moment, she saw not princess or envoy, but one leader among many. As evening fell, Sarah met with trainer Maria Bell to plan future exchanges. They walked along a crystal canal in the palace gardens. Sarah spoke of establishing an academy where humans and Valari could learn side by side. Maria listened and nodded. "This will ensure we never forget what we have built," she said. Sarah agreed and sketched layouts on a notepad. They planned lecture halls, sparring arenas, and living quarters where students from both worlds would share meals and stories. Sarah felt excitement at the thought of young cadets growing together. She knew the academy would stand as a living promise beyond any treaty. The next day brought troubling news. A border outpost reported renewed skirmishes, with rogue pirates who refused to accept the alliance. Settlers there feared for their lives. Sarah gathered scout reports and set out with a small envoy to assess the situation. She traveled aboard a Velo cruiser, the engines humming softly under her. She studied maps and talked with commanders. When they arrived at the rocky world of Ceres Beta, she saw the damage: burned huts, collapsed domes, and frightened survivors hiding in caves. Sarah felt anger at the pirates, but also a duty to protect the innocent. Sarah organized a rescue and rebuild effort. She led teams to clear the battlefield, repair shelters, and escort settlers back to safety. She worked alongside engineers to set up defensive outposts and training for local volunteers. Children who watched her battle on the field now helped her carry supplies. Sarah knelt beside them and showed how to mend fabric into bandages. Her gentle voice calmed their fears. When the final defenses stood ready, Sarah addressed the settlers. She spoke of hope and unity, and they cheered at her promise to guard them. She felt that every life saved strengthened the bond between worlds. During the mission, Sarah took a moment alone on a hill overlooking the settlement. She watched human and Velari engineers mix their tools and techniques to rebuild homes. She thought of her own home on Velari, where she had grown weak before. Now she felt strong and certain. She knelt, pressed her hands to the earth, and made a vow in Velari language to protect peace wherever it was threatened. The wind carried her words across the fields and into the hearts of those who rebuilt below. When the task was done, Sarah returned to the capital with John and the envoy. They arrived to a hero's welcome. Trumpets sounded, and crowds lined the streets. Sarah waved at the cheering people, her heart full. She rode beside John in an open carriage, banners of Earth and Velari flying overhead. At the palace gates, King Orion awaited with a proud smile. He embraced Sarah and said, "You have proven that peace is stronger than any blade." Sarah bowed to him and then to the crowd. She knew that this moment would be remembered in stories for generations. In the days that followed, Sarah took on her new role as Ambassador of Unity. She held meetings with human leaders, traveled to distant worlds to inspect joint outposts, and oversaw construction of the Joint Academy. Each day brought new challenges, but Sarah met them with patience and courage. She wrote letters to young cadets, encouraging them to learn both Velari grace and human resilience. She guided committees that planned cultural exchanges, art exhibits, and festivals celebrating both traditions. Her life, once simple and sheltered, now pulsed with purpose. One quiet evening, Sarah and John walked along the palace ramparts under 6 Velari moons. Sarah leaned on the stone parapet and looked at the stars that shone in shifting colors. John stood beside her, silent. Sarah spoke softly. "Our worlds are linked now. We have built something that cannot be broken." John nodded and said, "And we will guard it together." Sarah turned and smiled at him. She felt that her journey had come full circle. The fragile girl who once trembled on human soil now stood as a strong leader between two civilizations. As Sarah returned to her chambers, she placed a small crystal on her desk. Inside, a tiny image of her and John on the cruiser's deck floated in suspended light. Sarah touched the crystal and remembered the first moment she felt hope. She lay down and closed her eyes. Her final thought before sleep claimed her was of new dawns, shared laughter, and a future where two worlds walked forward together. The fragile princess was gone. In her place stood a warrior, a diplomat, and a bridge uniting all under the same stars.